Hey guys, and welcome back to Useless Historian. Tonight, we're going far back, farther than memory, farther than written words. Back to a time when the sky wasn't explained, and nothing was taken for granted, especially the light. In a world where cold, dark, and hunger waited beyond every sunrise, the sun wasn't just light. It was everything. It was warmth. It was direction. It was hope, and to the first people who looked up and waited for it each morning, it was the first God. This is the story of what the sun meant before science, before calendars, before clocks, when fire and sky were the same thing, and people lit their days with faith, not facts. If you enjoy these quiet journeys into the ancient past, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need a little warmth tonight. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Now, let's begin. The first morning they ever noticed the light. It wasn't the first sunrise. Not truly. The sun had risen long before them, long before eyes knew how to see, or skin knew how to feel warmth. But it was the first time someone noticed it. Not with words, because those hadn't yet arrived, but with breath, with stillness, with a long, slow blink at the edge of the sky. They had survived another night, huddled together in the dark, wrapped in animal hides that smelled of smoke and sweat. The wind had whispered against the cracks of the cave mouth all night long, and for a while they weren't sure the world would keep turning, but then it came, not all at once. Just a faint shift, a softness where the black used to be, not light yet, but the promise of it. A grey glow sliding into blue, a warm colour on the horizon that had no name yet, and they looked. They watched, not because they were curious, but because it was something they could feel, on their skin, in their chest, in the way the air changed. It touched their faces like a hand, quiet and steady. It pulled colour from stone, and made the ground seem awake again, and it didn't ask for anything in return. It just arrived. Every morning, silently, gently, and they began to wonder if it chose to. The oldest of them, the ones whose hair had begun to turn pale like the moon, were the first to sit in stillness when the light returned. They didn't speak. There weren't enough words for this kind of thing, but they felt something they didn't have a name for. Gratitude, relief, fear, maybe. Because what if it didn't come back tomorrow? The children watched the elders, and they began to sit still too, not because they understood, but because they could feel that something important was happening, something that didn't come from hunger or fire or cold, something higher. And just like that, without ceremony, they began to give the sun their silence. That silence became a ritual, not spoken, not planned, but something passed from body to body, from gaze to gaze, a stillness every morning. As the light poured in, the world was still wild. They had to hunt, they had to move, they had to survive, but not before that moment, not before the sun had its chance to be seen. They didn't worship it to the way we think of worship. There were no carved idols or songs, there were no temples or books, just space, just breath, just attention. That was how they honored it. By noticing, by understanding, in the deep animal parts of themselves, that without it, nothing would grow, nothing would move, nothing would begin. And so in that ancient place, before stories had shape and names had meaning, they looked at the sky, and for the very first time, they saw more than light. They saw power, they saw memory, they saw the beginning of time itself, and slowly the idea formed, not in language, but in feeling. This must be a god. Why they faced east with their eyes closed? They didn't know directions the way we do now. There were no maps, no compasses, no words like east or north or sunrise. But their bodies knew. Somehow, without needing to measure or explain, they always turned toward the place where the sky began to change. And slowly, over time, they learned that if you waited long enough, if you were still enough, light would come from that direction. Again and again, no matter how long the night, no matter how hard the wind. And so they began to sit there, still, quiet, waiting, not just to warm their faces, but because it felt like the right thing to do, the necessary thing, the respectful thing. They would kneel or crouch, or simply sit in the low grass or in the doorway of the cave, not together, not in lines or ranks, but scattered, each one alone in their own quiet space, yet joined by something unspoken. They weren't trying to see the light. That came later. First, they had to feel it. So they faced the place it came from, the place where the dark first gave way, and they closed their eyes. It was not for sleep, it was something else. A way to notice the warmth before it arrived. A way to sense the brightness without being overwhelmed by it. A way to prepare, because in their hearts, in the memory passed down not through stories but through gestures and rhythms, they believed that the sun could only be welcomed by those who waited with humility, and nothing said humility more than meeting the great light of the sky with eyes closed and hands still. Some would breathe deeply, in slow, even intervals, as though their breath might match the rhythm of the coming day. Others would hum, low, vibrating sounds that barely stirred the air, as though they were echoing the earth's own heartbeat. A few simply knelt in silence, hands pressed together, or resting gently in the dirt, feeling the coolness of the earth one last time before it began to warm. This wasn't about worship in the way we use the word now. There were no prayers, no chants, no bargains, just presence, just the choice to greet the day, without needing to be first, without needing to see it before anyone else. With eyes closed, they made room for the sun to arrive on its own terms, and they believed that the sun noticed, that the sun rewarded those who waited, those who did not rush, or demand, or speak its name too loudly. Because to shout at the sky was to misunderstand it. The sun was not a servant, it was not an answer, it was an elder, older than anything else they knew. And you did not look directly at an elder unless you were ready to understand what you were seeing. And so they turned their faces east, and let the warmth reach them before the light did. And as it did, they stayed still, eyes still closed, until the moment came, and it always did, when the light was too strong to ignore, when even the backs of their eyelids burned orange and gold, when the cold on their cheeks gave way to a pulse of warmth. That was when the day began, not with movement, not with words, but with the slow, sacred opening of eyes. One by one they would look out over the land again, and it would be the same place, but different, sharper, brighter, more alive. Shadows had length, stones had color, the trees had shape again, and though no one spoke of it, not then, they all felt the same thing rising in their chest, not relief, not exactly, something more like being chosen. They had faced the morning with patience, they had greeted the first god without pride, and so, once again, they had been allowed to stay. The shadow that proved the sun was watching. It started as something they didn't understand, a line that followed them, a shape that changed depending on when they moved or where they stood, a darker copy of their body, stretched or shortened, always silent, always watching. At first the shadow was more mystery than meaning, something strange, something neither living nor dead, a mark that didn't stay, yet always returned. But over time someone noticed something more. It wasn't random, it bent and shifted with the sun. The higher the light in the sky, the smaller the shadow, the lower it dipped, the longer the shape became, and as days passed and seasons shifted, they began to see a rhythm in it. The shadow had a pattern, and that pattern belonged to the sun. It was then they began to believe the shadow wasn't theirs at all. It was the sun's, not its body, not its breath, but its way of seeing. A signal, a reminder, a proof, because even if the sun was far above them, unreachable and quiet, it left something behind, a reflection, a mark, a silent presence that changed only when they moved. The shadow became a thread, delicate but unbreakable, between the sky above and the earth below, between the god that burned in the sky and the ones who walked under it. Children learned to play with their shadows before they understood what they were. They jumped and watched the dark shape mimic them. They danced and saw it stretch and fold like a companion. And when the sun began to dip low, and the shadows stretched far out behind them, the elders would call the children back, not out of fear, but reverence, because long shadows meant the sun was leaving, and when the god withdrew its hand, it was time to show respect. They began to measure the day with shadows, not words. They knew when to gather, when to rest, when to begin the fire, all based on how long their shadow reached. 1 hand length, the day had begun. 3 length, time to prepare for dusk. A body's full stretch across the dirt, time to return home. Even the hunters carried the knowledge. A well-placed stone beside a sleeping mat told them when to rise. The moment the shadow of a spear tip touched that stone, the sun had reached its mark, and it was time to move. The sun did not speak, but it left messages, if you knew where to look, and the shadow was its quiet language. Some said the shadow was the sun's way of remembering, that it needed to cast a piece of itself onto each person, so it wouldn't forget who it had warmed. Others believed the shadow was a test, that the sun was checking to see who still walked the earth, and if your shadow stopped moving for too long, perhaps the sun would stop looking for you. The wise ones, the ones who sat on high stones and watched the world as if it were a kind of breath, said something different. They said the shadow was your soul, and the sun was weighing it, that each day it marked you, measured you, stretched you thinner, or folded you tighter, and by the time your shadow disappeared entirely, when the night had fully come, your soul had been judged, not with cruelty, not with punishment, but with truth, because the sun, as they believed, did not lie. It warmed those who faced it. It withdrew from those who turned away. It could not be bribed, or convinced, or fooled. It simply watched, and the shadow it cast told the whole story. Even in moments of stillness, when no one moved, and the world seemed to pause, the shadows would change. They crawled slowly, like thoughts across the earth. The sun high above turned in its vast silent arc, and with it, the dark shapes on the ground stretched, curled, and disappeared. At night, when there were no shadows at all, they felt the absence of being seen. The moon gave some light, the stars gave beauty, but neither cast the kind of mark that followed your footsteps. In darkness you could forget where you stood. You could forget you were being watched, and so they cherished the return of the sun, not only for warmth, or light, or the promise of food, but for the shadow, that small, strange, silent echo that proved they were still real, that they still moved, that they were still here. Over time some began to speak to their shadows, quiet words, like secrets. Some believed the shadow could carry messages back to the sky, that if you whispered the right thing at the right moment, when the sun was just at the edge of the world, the God above might hear it, might understand it, and carry that memory into tomorrow. Even the dying were laid down in the path of the light, so that the last shadow cast would belong not just to them, but to the sun. It was a way of marking passage, a way of saying, I was seen, I was known. And so each day when they stepped out into the world and saw their shadow fall beside them, they didn't just see darkness, they saw connection, a signal, a quiet truth from the oldest light in the sky. I see you, I still remember. The daylight that returned when all hope was gone. There had been too many nights. That's what they said, quietly, around the fire that wouldn't stay lit. The wind had howled for days. The clouds had rolled in and never left. Smoke from their fires curled in strange, nervous ways, too heavy, too cold. The animals were gone. The birds had stopped moving. And the sky was not the sky anymore. Just a sheet of grey that didn't speak. The elders stopped guessing. The young stopped asking. And somewhere between the long silence and the last ember, something shifted in them. Not panic, that came earlier. This was something colder, something stiller. The sense that maybe the light was done, that the great warmth had turned away for good, that whatever they'd done wrong, whatever rules they had forgotten, the sun had taken notice. For generations, it had always come back, through every storm, every deep winter. Even when it hid, it returned eventually. But this time, it didn't. Not on the first day, not on the third, not on the seventh. They stopped counting after that. Some believed they had lost their place, that the sun had found others, people who waited better, prayed harder, kept the flame alive longer. Others believed they had offended it, burned something sacred, spoken too loudly, faced away at the wrong moment, and some simply stopped believing altogether. Not in the sun itself, it had existed, they had felt it, but in the idea that it would always return. And then, one morning, it did. Not with trumpets, not with color, just a pale crack of warmth along the far edge of the horizon, faint, uncertain. Like it was trying to remember the way back. Someone saw it first, and whispered. Then another looked up, then another, and slowly, without permission, every head lifted. No one spoke. It was too fragile, too sacred, as if a single sound might send it fleeing again. But they saw it, light, not golden, not strong but real, pressing back against the sky. The grey began to break, one slow ripple at a time, and behind it, the old god emerged. Dim, yes, tired perhaps, but alive. Some wept, not with joy, but with something older, a release, as if they had been holding their breath through all the nights, and finally, their lungs remembered what to do. Some knelt, some reached their hands toward it, palms open like bowls, hoping the light might notice them, might bless them, might forgive. That day no one hunted, no one moved far from the clearing. They stayed where they were, warmed by something that didn't quite reach their skin, but reached somewhere deeper. They didn't talk about what it meant, not directly, but they changed. From that morning forward, they treated each sunrise not as routine, but as a gift, a mercy, a decision made in their favor. They greeted it differently, not just with closed eyes or still hearts, but with offerings. Charred wood arranged carefully, stones stacked with intention, a single carved line on a cave wall, facing east, because now they knew the sun didn't owe them anything. And if it came back, it meant something had been forgiven, that they had one more day. Why the fire looked so much like the sky? At first, they didn't connect them. One was above, distant, untouchable. The other was here, on the ground, in the pit, in their hands. The fire they fed each night was small, made of sticks and dry moss, born from sparks and breath. It needed tending. It needed them. But the sun needed no one, and yet, it was hard not to notice. The way the flames moved, slow at first, then wild, then steady again, was familiar. The way it changed the color of everything it touched. The warmth that spread outward, not in lines, but in waves. When they stared too long at it, they felt the same ache behind their eyes that they got when they stared too long at the morning light. That strange flicker of gold in the center, the shadows cast long and sharp, the pull towards silence, it was all the same. They began to realize that the fire was not just warmth, it was a reflection, a memory, a piece of the sun they could hold. Some believed the fire came from the sky, that the first flame had fallen, not by accident, but as a gift, a piece of the sun's own breath, curled into a bolt of lightning, or hidden inside a dry branch, cracked by the wind. Others said it was stolen, taken by something that walked between worlds, something clever enough to trap the light and bring it to the earth. But however it came, one truth remained. It looked too much like the sun to be coincidence. They didn't need to explain it. The feeling was enough. Sitting by the flames at night, they would look into the center of it and feel a kind of remembering, a stillness, a reverence that felt too big for the pit it came from. Some stared until tears ran down their cheeks, not from smoke, but from something deeper, a grief, maybe, or a joy they didn't have words for. Even the youngest knew not to laugh near the fire, not loudly, not mockingly. There was something watching through it, something listening. It crackled like breath, it danced like it had a memory, it consumed everything, but left behind warmth. That was the same as the sun. The light above burned without asking, and still, they thanked it. When the fire rose high, when the wood was dry, and the wind gentle, it stretched toward the sky as if reaching home, and the flames, orange and white and sudden blue, twisted in ways no other thing on earth could. It wasn't like water, which flowed downward. It wasn't like earth, which stayed. Fire rose, always. It reached. That reaching was what they began to understand. Fire wasn't just heat, it was the act of longing, of connection, a reminder that what was above them, the first God, had sent down a whisper of itself, and that whisper burned. It spoke in flickers. It reminded them that warmth could be made from nothing, that darkness was not permanent, that light could live in their own hands. So they treated it with respect. They gave it offerings, not just fuel, but meaning, bits of bone, woven grasses, old tools that had broken and could no longer serve. They burned them not to erase, but to send upward, because maybe, just maybe, fire carried things back to where they came from. Some claimed to see visions in the flame, faces, places, shapes that reminded them of hunts, or dreams, or the sunlit places they'd never reach. Others simply sat still, eyes half-lidded, letting the warmth wash over them, letting the fire hold their stories without asking anything in return. It was said that when the last fire died in a camp, something changed. Not just the cold, not just the dark, but the silence too. The absence of the fire's voice was like losing a friend, a protector, a quiet mind that had kept watch through the night. They never lit a fire without purpose, never let it burn wild or without shape. Each spark, each coal, was the sun in miniature, a god small enough to sit beside. And when they carried embers from one place to the next, wrapped in moss and ash and bark, they carried more than survival. They carried memory, light, trust. They carried the sun. When they thought the sun had abandoned them. It happened once, or maybe more than once. The stories blurred with time. But one story was remembered, not because it was loud or tragic, but because it left a mark deep in the bones of those who lived through it. The time the sun didn't come back when it should have. Not just a late dawn, not just a cloudy morning. The true absence. The sky held in shadow for days, maybe weeks. No warmth, no gold, just grey upon grey, like the world had been wrapped in wet wool and forgotten. They had survived winters before. They had waited through storms. They had seen the sky go strange, but never like this. never so long. At first, they explained it away. The old ones said it was just another turn of the earth, that the light would find them again if they stayed patient. But patience stretched thin. The fire needed more wood than they had gathered. The game trails went silent. The birds changed their songs or stopped singing altogether. Even the wind, which normally howled and moved through the bones of the land, became still, too still, like the earth was holding its breath, and slowly, so did they. One by one faces turned toward the place where the sun should have risen. Eyes wide, then narrowed, then closed altogether. They made the old gestures, palms open, knees bent, heads low, but the horizon gave them nothing. No orange rim, no pink warmth, just the same grey curtain pulled tighter each day. Whispers began to spread through the sleeping mats at night. Had they done something wrong? Was it the fire they let die too early? Was it the story someone forgot to tell, the one that kept the sky in balance? Had they spoken too loudly, or eaten something sacred by mistake? One elder, the one with the deep-cut lines around her mouth and the single cloudy eye, said nothing for 3 days. When she finally did speak, she said only, "It is not angry, it is waiting," but no one asked her what it meant. They just kept watching the sky, and then came the cold. Not the cold of winter, the expected ache that wrapped around fingers and clung to the tips of ears, but something else, something heavier. A cold that crept into the lungs and made the breath short, that turned meat stiff before it finished cooking, that cracked the water inside their wooden bowls. Even inside the cave, hope dulled. The children stopped asking when it would be warm again. The fire was lit longer, fed more carefully, guarded like a heartbeat, but it wasn't enough. It was a sun-shaped hole they couldn't fill. Some of them stopped looking upward. They turned their backs to the horizon, focused on tasks, on the ground, on keeping fingers moving, because staring too long at an empty sky made the mind go strange. One night, someone stood outside the cave until their feet went numb and their knees locked. They said they were listening for the sun, trying to hear its footsteps. Others pulled them back inside, whispering comforts they didn't believe. But not all gave up. A few kept rising before light, sitting in the old spot, facing east with their eyes closed, not because they expected to see anything, but because the ritual mattered. If the sun was gone, they said, we must keep its place ready, leave the seat unfilled, but never forgotten. And then, one morning, just as the sky reached its most familiar grey, it changed. Subtly, the colour softened, less ash, more silver. Then at the edge of the hills, a thin line of warmth broke through. It wasn't yellow, not yet, but it was light, real light. No one spoke. They just watched. As it grew, the clouds slowly split, not apart, but upward, peeled back like something tired of hiding. And behind them, the sun, dim, hesitant, but real. The god had returned. The warmth didn't reach their skin that day, but it reached their hearts. It reached their silence. It reached the space they had kept for it, and it filled that space like a long-lost friend stepping back through the threshold. No apologies, no promises, just presence. The sun had not abandoned them, it had paused, and they had waited, and for that, they were remembered. The word, they whispered to make it rise. They never shouted at the sun. That was one of the oldest rules, though no one could say who first made it. The sun was not something you commanded, it was not something you begged, it was something you waited for, something you spoke to in the softest voice, the way you'd speak to a frightened animal or an old friend who had once been wounded, quietly, carefully, honestly. And yet, they had a word for it, a word not spoken in daylight, not passed in story, not carved into stone, a word that belonged only to the throat and the breath and the quiet before the sky turned gold. It was said low, just above a whisper, not in unison, not in ritual, but alone, usually whispered by whoever happened to be awake just before the horizon began to shift. The word had no meaning in the way we understand words. It wasn't about grammar or language. It didn't translate. It couldn't be written. It was more of a feeling passed through sound, a memory shaped in breath, and it was always given with the eyes closed, head tilted slightly upward, hands still, chest open. The ones who used it believed it helped the sun find its way back, not because the sun needed guidance, but because they did. The word wasn't magic. It didn't command the heavens, but they believed that every time it was spoken, truly spoken with the right kind of stillness behind it, the sun heard. not with ears, with attention, with memory, and that small sound, shaped by the hope of the one who offered it, was enough to remind the sky it was wanted. The oldest among them had stopped saying the word aloud. They mouthed it instead, lips barely moving, the shape of the breath enough to honor it. Some said the word wasn't even sound anymore, but a thought, a wish, a pull from within, something that lived deeper than the throat, something that was inherited, like a scar or a song only half remembered. One child once asked what the word was. The elder only smiled and said, "You'll know it when you need it." And the child believed them, because this was not a word you were taught. It was one that came to you, often in the dark, in moments of uncertainty, or grief, or fear, when your body instinctively turned toward the east, and your heart begged the sky not to forget you. That's when it came. The whisper. It might sound different in every voice, higher in one, broken in another, shaped by hunger, or hope, or the ache of waiting. But whatever it was, the sun knew it. It was the sound of someone choosing not to give up, choosing to speak, softly, into the silence of the world, even when the sky gave no answer. They didn't speak the word during the day. It belonged only to the time before light, to the moment just before warmth returned, that thin edge of time when the stars faded, but the sun hadn't yet arrived. The word lived there, in the breath between endings and beginnings. It was spoken with no expectation of reward, no certainty, just faith, not in gods, not even in the sun, but in the rhythm itself, the ancient, unbreakable rhythm of light, following dark, again and again, forever. The whisper wasn't a command, it was a reminder, a signal to the sky that someone was still waiting, and the sun, in its way, always answered. Not loudly, not suddenly, but gently. First the shadows softened, then a corner of the sky became less black, then that old line of gold, so thin you could mistake it for a trick, appeared along the hill's edge. Those who had whispered it did not celebrate, they did not cheer, they simply breathed, eyes still closed, letting the light arrive. The word was not spoken again until the next darkness, but it waited in the throat, always, that ancient syllable, made of longing and memory and quiet defiance, ready to rise again, whenever the night grew too long, and every morning that the sun returned, they believed it had heard, not because the world needed it to rise, but because they did. Why they buried their dead facing the dawn. They didn't have words for heaven, not yet, not in the way we think of it, but they had the light, they had the warmth that returned every morning, even after the coldest, longest nights, and they had memory, the kind that stayed in the bones long after names had faded. They didn't write prayers or carve beliefs into stone. They watched the sky, and they noticed that the sun came back, that it never rose in the west, that even in its absence, it remembered which way to return from, and slowly they came to believe that this direction, this daily return from silence into light, mattered. So when someone died, they turned them toward it, not by accident, not for ritual's sake, but because they wanted that person to see it again, even if only in spirit, even if only in the shape of memory. The body was laid carefully, not curled or hidden, but stretched with arms folded in quiet rest, face tilted just slightly toward the place where the sun would rise, a silent promise that they wouldn't miss the light when it returned. The first time it was done, no one spoke. They simply placed the elder down, near the edge of the old fire circle, and turned her gently toward the open sky. Someone whispered that she would want to see morning again, and everyone else nodded, not because it was true, but because it felt true. That was enough. It became a practice then, quiet, never explained aloud, but every grave after that one followed the same rule, even when the ground was hard, even when the hill sloped wrong, even when there were trees in the way. They cleared the space, they made sure of the angle. They faced the body toward the east, because they believed the sun knew faces, and maybe, if it saw that familiar one lying there, quiet, still, unblinking, it might remember the warmth it once gave them, might send just a little light down, a farewell, a recognition, not for the sake of magic, just for mercy. Sometimes, they buried offerings with the body, not food, not tools, but fire itself, a coal wrapped in moss, still warm, a spark, sleeping inside a pouch, just in case, just so the soul didn't forget the way back, just so they wouldn't wake cold, wherever they had gone. They didn't fear death the way we do now, but they respected it, knew it wasn't just an end, It was a passage, a narrowing path into silence, and they wanted that silence to be touched by light, even just at the edges. That's why the graves were shallow, but never exposed, covered with earth, but not sealed. They left room for the light to find its way in. Some believed the sun could only see those who remembered to look for it. So facing the dead toward the dawn was more than kindness. It was invitation, participation, a way of saying we still remember the direction of the light, so should they. In times of famine or war or frost, when loss came in waves and burial was rushed, they still took the time to check the direction, even if the fire had gone out, even if the sky was thick with clouds, even if no one had the strength to stand. Someone would crawl to the clearing, find east by instinct alone, and mark it with a line in the dirt, because that mattered. That line, that one line, east, held more meaning than all the other stories. Some said that the sun was a god who carried the souls of the dead across the sky each morning, that when you saw a particularly soft or golden dawn, it meant someone you loved had joined the journey, that the brightness was their soul becoming part of the light. Others said it was simpler, that the dead, like the living, just missed the sun, and so they faced it, hoping for one more warmth. In the silence after burial, before the soil was fully packed, they would pause, just for a breath, and look out toward the horizon, waiting, not for signs, not for miracles, just in case the sun decided to rise early, just in case it wanted to welcome someone home. Even now, when no one remembers why, the oldest graves face east. Even now, when the words have changed and the gods have new names, something in us still turns that way at first light, still watches the rim of the sky for gold, still believes without quite saying so, that the light knows our names, that the dead are not forgotten, if they are buried where the morning can find them. That dawn is more than a time, it's a direction, and a promise. When the sun paused too long on the horizon, it wasn't just that the sun was late, that had happened before. Clouds could stall it, mists could soften its edge. Sometimes the earth simply turned in a way that made the sky seem slower, thicker, heavier. But this was different. The sun had risen, yes, but then it had stopped, or seemed to. It hovered, low and golden, just above the curve of the earth, neither rising nor sinking, a single burning eye, unmoving, staring back at them from the place it always passed through quickly. And that slowness, that unnatural stillness, unsettled them in a way they didn't know how to name. It stayed there so long that shadows grew confused, not long and elegant, as they did in early morning, not short and sharp, like those cast by noon. These shadows wavered, they moved even when nothing else did, like they too were unsure which way time was turning. People stood in silence, watching, first out of habit, then out of awe, then out of something colder. They didn't speak the fear aloud, not at first, but it lived behind every glance. Had it changed its mind? Had it decided not to rise after all? No one knew what it meant. Was the sun testing them, warning them? Was it trapped, wounded? Was it deciding something about them, about the world? They had no way to answer. So they waited, and waiting in that world was never still. It meant watching for shifts in the wind, in the birds, in the breath of the trees. It meant tending the fire even when warmth touched your skin, because warmth could vanish without warning. It meant sitting with your back straight, listening to the way silence bent between heartbeats. Someone said it looked like the sun was remembering something, or forgetting, or choosing. But that idea frightened them more than silence, because if the sun could choose, it could leave. It could stop. The children asked why it wasn't moving, and no one lied to them. No one said it's fine or it will pass. Instead they said, we're watching too. And the children understood what that meant. It meant we don't know either, but we're here. We'll stay awake. The sun stayed there until the animals grew restless, until the fires began to hiss and pop in confusion, until even the shadows seemed tired of shifting, until the air began to feel wrong. Not colder, not hotter, just waiting, like a question that hadn't been asked yet. They watched the sun together, not blinking. Their faces felt dry, their breath shallow. No one moved, no one dared, and then finally it moved again. Slowly, almost reluctantly, it began its climb. Not a burst, not a brightening, just a small steady rising, as if it had been convinced, as if it had decided yes, for now to return. The relief was not loud, no cheers, no weeping, just a long breath, let out together, shoulders slumping, hearts settling. The old ones called it the sun's second thought, a moment where it had paused to weigh the world, to listen to all things breathing beneath it, and to decide whether to rise or rest. After that, they added a new gesture to their morning ritual. Not just the turning toward the east, not just the closed eyes and open hands, but a bow, a slight one, not from the waist, but from the neck. A nod, a way of saying, "Thank you for choosing to rise." Again, they didn't ask the sun why it had hesitated. They didn't seek signs. They simply remembered, and passed it on, whispered the story beside fires, carved small lines into the stone to mark the strange day, taught their children not to take upward motion for granted, because now they knew the sun didn't just rise, it decided to. And one day, it might not. So each morning it did meant everything. The first time they blamed the sun for pain, they had always worshipped it, or if not worshipped, they had watched it, trusted it. The sun was a giver. That much had always been true. It gave light, warmth, time, rhythm. It peeled back the cold and shook silence from the trees. It returned after every dark night. It drew the animals out from shadow, painted the rivers gold, dried the wet skins they wore after the rain. Its rising was not questioned, and its power was not feared, not yet. But that changed, because there was a day when the sun did something different, not in what it offered, but in what it took, and for the first time, they felt harmed by it. And worse, they couldn't explain why. It began with the heat, not just warmth, not the familiar comfort of morning thawing their bones, but something heavier, something sharp. The kind that didn't rest on the skin but pierced through it, the kind that made the air shimmer and the breath stick, the kind that turned walking into labor and standing still into suffering. The animals hid, the ground cracked, pools vanished, even the birds, once joyful at dawn, fell quiet. The fire wasn't needed, it was feared. The elders stayed in shadow, children cried without understanding. The hunters returned early with dry tongues and sunburned shoulders. The meat spoiled faster, the rivers shrank. No one said it aloud at first. You didn't speak ill of the sun, but the glances began. The squints of blame, the uneasy questions. Had it grown angry? Had they taken too much light? Was it punishing them? One old woman whispered that maybe the fire they carried, their precious portable flame, had offended the great one in the sky, that stealing even a piece of its essence and dragging it around in bundles of moss and ash might have been too bold, that perhaps the sun was reminding them, "I am not yours." Others believed it was something else, that maybe someone had failed to speak the right word at dawn, that a death had gone unburied, or a prayer left unsaid. The tribe gathered one evening, when the heat finally sank behind the hills, and they sat in uneasy silence as the last of the light dragged itself across the sky. The fire was lit, low, careful, afraid to compete, and still no one said the word blame. Not directly, but it hung there, in the space between breath and smoke, in the way they looked at the horizon, not with hope, but with weariness. Then came the burns. One child reached for a sun-warmed stone too quickly. Her skin blistered. A man collapsed during a hunt, his body steaming, his words slurring. The shade of the trees, once a comfort, felt thin and uncertain. Their shadows were too short. Time felt skewed. The pain wasn't just physical, it was disorientation, the betrayal of something once trusted, the realization that the same light that grew berries, that warmed the cave, that pushed back the cold, could also scorch, starve, strip, and for the first time someone said it. It hurts us. Not loud, but clearly, a voice like dry grass, and when no one corrected her, when no one gasped or scolded, it became truth. The sun, giver of life, was also a thing that could take it. The next day they covered themselves, not with pride or decoration, but in defense, hides over shoulders, mud on cheeks, mats woven not for comfort, but for shade. They began to move only when the light slanted low. They shifted their rhythms. The day was no longer a time of doing. It became a time of caution, but still they didn't stop honoring it. That was important. Reverence did not die, it simply changed shape. Now the sun was not just a friend, it was a god, a real one. The kind with moods, the kind with mystery, the kind who gave and also took. They learned balance, learned to rise early, to speak gently at dawn, and to retreat before the day grew too thick. They stopped building too close to open fields. They sang different songs, softer ones, slower, not to praise, but to soothe. And every evening, When the sun finally dipped behind the farthest hill, they sighed, not because they were glad it was gone, but because they were grateful it had passed without more punishment. The lesson stayed. The light was still sacred, but now they knew it was also fire. Why the light wasn't welcome in some places. Not everywhere wanted the light. That was one of the harder things to understand when the world was still new, when the sun was still being named, when warmth was still considered a gift. But there were places where its presence wasn't greeted with gratitude, places where it arrived like a trespasser, not a savior, where shadows were chosen, not endured. And when light came creeping in, it was met not with open arms, but with stillness and silence. These were not always dangerous places. Some were caves, deep and winding, filled with air that hadn't moved in centuries. Others were groves where the trees grew too close together, where the ground stayed soft and cold no matter the season. And some were simply corners of the earth that had decided long ago that they preferred quiet to clarity. The people knew where these places were. They marked them, not with stones or fences, but with memory. Children were told not to play near the water that never reflected the sky. Hunters were warned not to track game into the hills, where the wind stopped speaking. Fires were not built there, not even the smallest coal was carried in, because even the flame seemed to flicker differently when brought too close. It wasn't fear, exactly, more like respect. The way you might speak softly in a room where someone is sleeping. You don't fear the sleeper, but you understand that your noise doesn't belong there. They said the light stirred things that preferred not to be stirred. Old griefs, forgotten names, shapes made of nothing but waiting. These places weren't evil, just untouched. And in a world where warmth meant life, where the sun's return was cause for ritual and whisper, these few corners where the light was refused felt sacred in their own way, like they belonged to an older agreement. Sometimes someone would wander in by accident, a traveler caught between rivers, a gatherer who followed a path too long. They would return changed. Not harmed, not haunted, just quieter. They spoke less, sat more, looked at fire like it was a question instead of an answer. And when asked what they'd seen, they'd say nothing. Not because nothing happened, but because they couldn't describe it. Only that it had felt private, like they had entered someone else's dream. The oldest among them said that light forgets, that every morning it arrives fresh, innocent, curious, and in doing so, it forgets to ask permission. But the dark remembers, it keeps, it holds, it waits, and there are things in this world that prefer to be held, not revealed. That's why, even during times of hunger, they didn't build fires in certain hollows. Even when warmth was scarce, even when sleep came shivering, they'd wrap themselves tighter and move elsewhere. They didn't question it. You don't argue with a place that listens more than it speaks. There was a cave, long collapsed now, where no fire ever lasted more than a few heartbeats. No matter the tinder, no matter the care, the flame would catch, glow bright for a breath, and then die. Not his, not smoke, just stop. And they stopped trying. They stopped bringing the light to places that refused it. They believed it was a kindness, that not all places were made for witnessing. Some were made for forgetting, or remembering, but only in silence. And the sun, as powerful as it was, did not argue with that. It passed over those places gently, casting its light around rather than into them. The people took that as a lesson. Not everything sacred needs to be seen, and not all warmth is welcome. So they let the dark keep its secrets, and they turned their fires elsewhere. The cave that held the memory of sunrise. They didn't remember the first time someone found it, only that it had already been known by the time the elders were young. The cave had no name, just a direction. East of the wide river, below the hill shaped like a broken tooth, past the grove where nothing grew in winter. You couldn't see the entrance unless you were looking for it. Even then it appeared slowly, not as a hole or a mouth, but a shadow that deepened as you moved closer. But what made it different wasn't its shape or size. It was what lived inside it. Not animals, not water, not even fire. It was something softer, a feeling, a presence. The old ones said the cave remembered the sun, and not in the way rock holds heat after a day's warmth. Not in the way light bends around stone. The memory here was deeper, quieter, as if the very walls had watched the first dawn and had never stopped thinking about it. Inside, the air was always cool, but never cold. The silence was thick, but kind. Light didn't reach far, only the faintest sliver made it in during early morning. But when it did, Just for a few heartbeats, the cave glowed with a color that didn't exist anywhere else. Not orange, not gold. Something older, something soft like dust and breath and hope. No one lit fire inside, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't want to. The light already there felt sacred. A flame would have been too loud, too bright, too alive. The glow that visited each morning asked for stillness. It didn't want company, it wanted to be witnessed. The elders taught the young to go there before their first hunt, to sit alone in the dark, facing the eastward curve of the stone, and wait, not for a sign, just for the light, just to feel what it meant to be seen by something ancient and patient. It wasn't a rite, it wasn't law, it was just understood, a silent invitation passed down across generations. Sometimes the light never came, clouds could hide it, rain could smother it, but the cave never changed. Its shape was the same, its breath was the same, and those who sat there, even in full dark, said they felt it anyway. The memory of sunrise didn't need light to exist. It was built into the stone itself, a warmth that didn't burn, a presence that didn't speak, a dawn that had already happened, and yet hadn't ended. They never painted on those walls, not like the other caves. No animals, no handprints, no symbols of fire or flight or feast. They said it would be disrespectful. You didn't mark a thing that was already sacred. You didn't add to something that had always been whole. Sometimes when someone died, someone old or kind or brave, their people would walk to the cave before burying them, not to leave the body there, but just to carry their name into that quiet space. They would whisper it once, just once, into the stillness, as if passing a message, as if asking the cave to remember them too, and it did. That's what they believed, that the cave remembered not just the light, but the people who had loved the light, that each sunrise it held was also a story, of breath, of waiting, of reverence. They never camped near it, never stayed long. You visited, you watched, you listened, and then you left. But the feeling came with you, that hush, that calm, that strange sense that you had seen something, or had been seen, without eyes. Even long after the world changed, when fewer people remembered the cave's path, the earth still held it, undisturbed, waiting, still facing east, still catching that ancient sliver of morning when the sun passed by, because some places didn't need people to keep memory. Some places remembered for themselves, and this cave, this quiet, watching place, had been holding the sunrise for longer than any voice could recall. It didn't chase the light, it cradled it, and never let it go. Why they marked stones to catch the light again. There came a time when the sun's path was no longer enough to trust on memory alone. Seasons shifted, the air changed, days stretched or shrank without warning. The light returned later, or left too soon. Shadows grew longer in ways that didn't match the stories. They began to feel untethered, like the rhythm that had once pulsed beneath their lives was fraying, slipping away grain by grain, as if the world itself had stopped keeping time for them. So they turned to the stone, not because it glowed or whispered or answered prayers, but because it stayed. It stayed through storm and snow, through flood and heat, long after huts had fallen and trails had vanished. It didn't move, and that to people who were trying to hold on to something steady was sacred. They began with notches, small lines scraped into rock, thin, shallow, almost invisible, not made to be beautiful, made to be returned to. A record, a reminder. This was where the sun had touched. This was the line where its first beam had landed. This was how long it took for the light to crawl across that ridge. Not a calendar, exactly, more like a memory that couldn't be forgotten. One notch for each day the sun returned the same way, another for when it didn't. They'd sit for hours, staring at the same patch of stone, waiting for the warmth to fall just right. And when it did, someone would mark it, not out of ceremony, but out of need. Later, the markings changed. They became grooves, then holes, then channels, carved deep enough for fingers to follow. Circles were etched into slabs. Stones were stood on end, angled, stacked. They weren't monuments. Not yet. Just tools. Shadows would stretch and land in just the right places. At least when the world remembered how to turn, they did this not to control the sun. They knew better than that, but they wanted to meet it. They wanted to be ready when it returned. And more than anything, they wanted to remember where it had been. Because when the sky went grey for too long, or the snow didn't melt when it should have, or the fire inside the cave began to feel like the only light left, they could look at those stones, touch those markings, and remember. It came before. It will come again. Some stones were passed down, carried when they moved camps, worn smooth by generations of hands. Others stayed exactly where they'd been placed, immovable, shaped not just by human hands but by seasons of watching and waiting. A few stood in circles, aligned just so, where the sunrise would split clean through the middle, on only one day a year. When that happened, no one shouted, no one clapped. They just stood there, heads bowed, as the light confirmed what their memory hoped was true. Over time, these stones took on stories. They weren't just markers, they were promises. They became part of the law. This is where the light first kissed the earth. This is where the long night ended. This is where our people learned to trust the sky again. Children were taught the grooves like songlines. Count to the third mark after the river thaws. Wait until the shadow touches the base before planting. These weren't rules. They were inheritances. And even when newer people came, building different homes and using other names for the sun, some of those stones stayed, quiet, heavy, watching, still catching light the way they always had, because the stones didn't care who carved them. They only cared that someone had, that someone once loved the light enough to try and hold it in stone. And even now, if you stand in certain fields, at just the right moment of dawn, and the air is still, and your eyes are open, you might see it too. That quiet line of gold sliding across a mark older than language, a reminder written in earth. The sun came back once, it will again. The ritual that only worked in full sun. They didn't remember how the ritual began. There was no origin story, no first telling, no name tied to its invention. It was just something that had always been done, or at least, that's how it felt. Passed from breath to breath, from gesture to gesture, old hands guiding young ones, until the doing became more important than the knowing. But there was one thing everyone agreed on. It only worked in full sun, not just light, not just day, not a sky covered in cloud, or a brightness softened by mist. It had to be clear, the kind of sky that rang blue like a struck stone, the kind of light that left no shadow unexplained, the kind of sun that watched without blinking. Only then would the ritual mean what it was supposed to mean. It wasn't grand, no drums, no fires, no raised voices. In fact, it was almost too quiet to be called a ritual at all. It involved sitting, always facing east, always at the same time, when the sun had fully lifted itself from the horizon, but not yet begun to climb high. It was a moment, stretched just long enough to feel like forever, but short enough that if you weren't ready you missed it. They would sit with their palms up, fingers slightly curled, as if holding something that had weight but no shape, their eyes closed, their backs straight, feet bare against stone or packed dirt, no cloth between them and the world, and most important of all, no words. That silence was part of it. Not just an absence of talking, but an invitation, a space into which the sun could move, not as light, but as presence. The warmth on the face, the glow through the lids, the breath held without needing to be told. That was how you knew it was working, not because something happened, but because something didn't. No shiver, no ache, no thought chasing thought, just stillness. If someone opened their eyes too early, the moment was broken. If someone spoke, even in a whisper, the chance was lost. If a cloud passed, even briefly, the ritual was ended. Not failed, exactly, but deferred, like a door gently closing, asking you to come back later, when you're more ready, more patient. Some said it was a way to speak to the sun, others said it was a way to listen to it, that it wasn't about requests or thanks or praise, just presence, just being there when it arrived, like greeting an old friend without needing to fill the air with noise. The elders said that the sun could feel the weight of a watching people, that it liked being noticed, that even across the great height of sky, the sun knew when eyes were closed in trust, in respect, not fear, that it responded by giving something back, not a gift you could hold, but a kind of knowing, a quietness that followed you into the rest of your day. Only a few ever spoke of what they felt during the ritual, a hum behind the ribs, a soft pressure between the eyes, a warmth not on the skin but beneath it. Most just nodded, afterward, as if to say yes, it was enough. They taught the children how to sit still. That was the hardest part. Stillness didn't come easy to small bodies, but over time the young ones learned, and when they did, when a child sat perfectly silent in the full light of morning, palms up, eyes closed, the adults would not speak of it. They would simply let it happen. Let the sun do its work. Sometimes the ritual was done for someone else. If a loved one had passed, they would sit for them, one person or many, all in a line, silent under the sun, as if the light could carry messages upward, or downward, or inward. No one tried to explain how it worked, they just knew it did, and when it was over, when the sun rose too high, or the moment slipped away, they didn't mark it with words. They opened their eyes slowly, stood quietly, moved gently, as if trying not to disturb something that still lingered in the air. Even in the hardest seasons, when food was thin, or the wind too loud, they tried, they made the time. Because the ritual wasn't about change, it wasn't about asking for better days, it was about remembering they existed at all, that the sun still came, that light still knew their names, that presence was enough, but only in full sun, because only then did the world stand still long enough to listen back. When the children asked what the sun ate, it started the way many important questions do, with a child, half awake, staring at the sky. The sun had just risen, full and golden and slow, brushing the tips of the trees with its gentle fire. The camp was quiet, still stretching, still blinking off the cold. A few low embers smouldered from the night's fire, sending up occasional sparks that danced into the air before vanishing. And amid all that stillness, the child looked up, squinted into the brightness, and asked, "What does the sun eat?" The question lingered, light as breath, but somehow heavier than it should have been. No one answered right away, not because they didn't want to, but because no one had thought to ask that before. They had stories about where the sun went, why it came back, what it meant, but what it needed, that was different. The elders didn't laugh. They never laughed at real questions. They looked at one another, then at the child, and then up into the warm sky, and slowly, without ceremony, they began to speak. "The sun eats time," one of them said, her voice soft. "Every day, a little more of it disappears into its mouth." Another added, "It eats shadow too. Have you noticed how the dark places shrink when it walks higher across the sky? That's because it's swallowing them." A third, younger voice, a cousin perhaps, offered this. "I think it eats dreams, the ones you forget when you wake up. It takes them and tucks them into the clouds." But none of those answers satisfied the child, who furrowed their brow and asked again, "But what does it eat when it's hungry?" That was the kind of question that echoed, not through the ears, but through the bones. From that day on, the question didn't fade. It grew. It made its way into stories told around the fire, into songs hummed during long walks, into carvings on bark and scratches in the dust. People began to wonder if the sun had needs like they did. Was it content? Could it go without? Did it grow tired? Lonely? Had it ever been full? Some began to notice patterns. The sun seemed stronger when the fires were plentiful, when people sang and danced and stayed close together. The mornings felt warmer, more eager. But when sorrow lingered, when too many voices had gone quiet, the light seemed duller, not weaker, but slower, like it was watching more than shining. So the people began to offer things, not sacrifices, not blood. The sun wasn't a thing to be feared, it was a thing to be nourished. They sang in the mornings, simple songs hummed in the throat, or drummed gently with fingers on wood or hide. They laid out pieces of food, not to burn them, just to let them rest in the light for a moment before being eaten. They told stories aloud, as the light shifted across their shelters, speaking directly into the open sky. All of it, they said, was for the sun, because if the sun gave light, warmth, time, then maybe it deserved something in return. They believed the sun liked stories most of all, especially the ones told by children. Laughter, they said, was like fruit for the sky, and dreams, the wild, strange ones shared over morning meals, were delicacies. When a child dreamed of a walking fish or a cave that breathed, the elders would listen carefully, then lift their hands and say, "Son, did you hear that one?" They didn't think the sun needed to eat, not in the way people did, but feeding it made them feel closer to it, more seen, more held. The rituals became a conversation, a quiet exchange. "You warm us, and we'll remember you." Some said the sun only truly hungered when it felt forgotten. That was the danger. Not storms, not winter, but silence. A day where no one looked up. A day where no one told a story, where no joy was shared beneath the light. That, they said, was what dimmed the sun. So they made sure to remember, even when times were hard, especially then, because in hunger, in cold, in fear, the sun still came, still walked the sky, still spilled itself over the earth, asking for nothing. And if all they could give in return was a story, a song, a small offering of laughter, then they would. Because when the children asked what the sun ate, they weren't really asking about the sun. They were asking what we owe the things that love us quietly, every day. Why they burned food on the tallest rock. It wasn't the biggest fire they ever made. It wasn't built for warmth, or for cooking, or for gathering around. In fact, most of the time, it stood alone, flickering quietly, wind tugging at its edges, far above the camp, where the wind was strongest and the trees had long since stopped growing. Just a small flame, on a stone that jutted out over the valley like a broken tooth. From down below, it looked like a star had come too close. Just a little light, barely visible in the daylight, but always there, always watching. They called it the gift fire, not because it gave something, but because it received. Long ago someone had climbed up there carrying only two things, a slice of dried meat and a question they didn't know how to speak aloud. They placed the food on the rock, not with ceremony, not with song, just a quiet motion. Then they set it alight. The wind almost stole the flame, but not quite. It caught, and the food began to curl and blacken, and a thin thread of smoke rose into the sky. That was the first time it was done, but not the last. Over time, the tallest rock became something more than stone. It became a meeting place between what they could touch and what they couldn't. Not gods, exactly. They didn't speak of them that way. More like forces, old, slow-moving, invisible currents that lived in the sky, the weather, the warmth. They believed the sun saw everything, but that it listened best when something was given. So they gave, not everything. Not wastefully, just small things. A root pulled from the cold ground, a strip of fat from a successful hunt, the first berry found at the edge of spring, not because they didn't want it, but because they did. Because offering something valuable meant more. It was a message that said, "We are not alone. We remember you." The climb was never easy. The path was steep, narrow in places, slick with lichen. Only those with sure feet and clear minds made the trip. And even then, not often, maybe once a season, maybe when someone had passed, maybe when the sun felt too far for too long. They didn't always burn food. Sometimes, they brought smoke from the home fire and let it drift from the rock. Sometimes, they left carvings. Sometimes, they simply sat, watching the horizon, whispering thanks for a warmth that never demanded thanks in return. But burning food, that was the most sacred. They said the smoke carried scent upward, that the sun could taste it, in a way, not like mouths do, but like memory does, the warmth of fat meeting flame, the sweetness of dried fruit turning black at the edges, the sharp crackle of roasted grain, all of it rising, mingling, becoming part of the wind that brushed the sun's face, and the sun responded, maybe not with words, but with softer mornings, longer autumns, a sudden break in the clouds on a hard day, or just a feeling, quiet and certain, that something vast and watching had nodded in return. Children weren't allowed to climb with gifts until they could understand the weight of what they brought. It wasn't about the size of the offering. It was about knowing why it mattered. That food was life. That fire was life. And that to give both at once was to say, "We trust the light will come again." Some called the flame on the rock the remembering flame, because it wasn't there to beg or plead. It was there to honor, to say, "We saw the light. We felt its warmth, and even when it goes, we won't forget." In time, even after the practice faded and the path to the stone grew over with moss and windswept debris, the rock still caught the first light of morning before anything else. And sometimes, only sometimes, on the stillest days a curl of smoke would rise from that spot, with no people nearby, no firewood, just the whisper of something old, and grateful, and unseen, as if the sun, remembering its gifts, was sending one back. The day the sky turned red before dusk. It began earlier than anyone expected. The sun was still high enough that people weren't yet thinking of shelter. Children were still out along the edge of the brush, tracking beetles in the dirt, tossing twigs into the stream. The fire hadn't been built up yet for the evening. No one had called the others to circle in. But the light, it changed. At first it was subtle, a strange warmth at the edge of things, not heat, but color. The dust on the path seemed to glow. The grass, usually a dull grey-green, took on the tone of embers. Faces looked strange, not sick, not sunburned, just lit from some unfamiliar angle, as though the sky had turned sideways. Then someone looked up, and they stopped moving, because the blue had gone, not softened into dusk, not faded into cloud, but vanished, and in its place was something deeper, thicker, a red that wasn't bright or fiery, but dark, like clay soaked in blood. It stretched from horizon to horizon, quiet and heavy, like a lid pressed down over the world. People began to gather without needing to be called, one by one, drawn by the same unease, the same sense of something wrong. There was no wind, no sound of birds, even the insects had gone silent, only the distant sound of water, and the breath of the watching crowd. Some knelt, others stood with their arms folded tight. The elders moved slowly, calmly, saying nothing, but their eyes did not leave the sky. One of them, the oldest, stepped forward and laid her palm against the trunk of a crooked tree near the fire pit. She closed her eyes and whispered something no one else could hear. No one lit a fire that night, not until the sky returned to its usual self, which it did, eventually, but not until long after the sun had disappeared beyond the hills. And even then, no one was quite sure if it was truly over, or just hiding. They had stories, of course, warnings passed down from long before, of skies that burned without heat, of days when the sun spoke in color instead of warmth, of times when the sky shifted not because of weather, but because something older had stirred. One tale said the red sky meant the sun had been wounded, not in body, but in spirit, that it had seen something it could not bear. Another said the sun had flared in anger, turning the sky red to remind the world that it was still a god, and not to be taken for granted. A softer story claimed the red sky was a message, a sign sent to the people, not in words, but in hue, that something was coming, something they needed to prepare for. Not war, not winter, but change, and change did come. The next morning, a herd moved through the valley that hadn't passed that way in years, fat with late summer meat, a gift, some said, an apology, others whispered, or maybe just a sign that the world hadn't turned its face away entirely. But still, something lingered. For many days afterward, people looked to the sky with new caution. Children stopped throwing stones for fun. Laughter came more quietly, more cautiously, as though afraid to wake something that might still be watching. The old woman who had touched the tree said little, but each evening, she knelt beside the fire and scattered red ochre dust into the flames. No one asked why. It became known as the day the sun showed its blood, not literally, but spiritually, as if even something so vast, so distant, could bleed in its own way, not with pain, but with feeling, a redness that came not from anger or injury, but from depth, from memory, from something the people weren't meant to understand, only to notice, and they did, because from that day forward, whenever the sky shifted near dusk, even slightly, people paused, they faced west, they lowered their heads, and they remembered what it had felt like when the world turned red before the fire had even been lit, when the sun reminded them, without a sound, that it could still surprise them, and that maybe they should be ready for it. Why they believed the sun could listen. It wasn't something they could prove. No one ever saw the sun lean closer, or change direction when a name was called. It never blinked in recognition, or pulsed with a sound the way thunder did. It didn't speak back, at least not in the way people understood speaking. But still, they believed. They believed the sun could listen, not just to voices, but to intention, to breath, to movement, to the way people lived beneath its gaze. You didn't need to shout. In fact, shouting was considered rude. If you wanted the sun to hear you, you spoke softly, or not at all. You thought clearly, shaped your hope like a bowl in the mind, and lifted it into the sky with silence. It was said that the sun heard better in the morning, that just after rising, before it had stretched itself across the land, it was still close enough to feel small things, footsteps, whispers, the warmth of someone offering thanks without needing a reason. So many made a habit of waking early, not for chores, not for duty, but simply to be there when the light returned. Not as worship, not exactly, more like respect. Some sat cross-legged and watched the horizon until the first light touched their skin. Others left small objects outside, a smooth pebble, a clean feather, a braid of hair, not as offerings, but as acknowledgements, as if to say, I was here, I remembered. Children were taught early not to speak unkindly under the open sky, not because the sun would punish them, but because it heard, and remembering that something was always listening, that there was a witness in the sky, made people more careful, more gentle. On days when things went wrong, a hunt failed, a shelter collapsed, someone fell ill, the people would sit in the light and say nothing. They wouldn't plead or beg, they would just sit, palms open, eyes steady. They believed the sun didn't need explanation, that it understood feeling more than words, that it listened to silence like a second language. Elders told of times when the sun answered, not with miracles, but with moments. A break in the clouds at the right time, a patch of warmth on cold skin, a sudden brightness that made someone pause, take a breath, remember they were alive. These were called sun replies. They were rare, but when they happened, no one doubted it. There were also songs, not sung directly to the sun, but sung around it, in the fields, by the river, while weaving or preparing meals, songs that told of the light's first arrival, or the way it made certain stones glow, or how it never asked for anything, but still gave everything. The songs weren't grand, just small reminders, spoken aloud so the sky could catch the shape of the words as they rose. Sometimes, at the end of a hard day, someone would turn toward the west and say only one word, listen, and they'd all grow quiet, watching the sky deepen, waiting for that last red-gold light to fall across their faces, not as a message, not as an answer, but as a moment shared. The belief wasn't about control. They didn't think they could change the sun's path, or make it do anything it didn't already plan to do. The belief was gentler than that. It was the feeling that nothing was truly said into emptiness, that even in a vast world, something was paying attention. And when the sun disappeared behind the hills, when the shadows took over and the sky went black, they didn't feel abandoned, because they believed the sun listened even then, not through sight, but through memory, and that was enough. The one who claimed to speak with the sun. They didn't call her a priestess. They didn't have that word. Not yet. They simply called her the one who listens when the sun stands still. A title not given but grown into. Slowly, like moss finds stone. No one remembered when she'd first said it, that she could speak to the sun, that she didn't just offer to it or thank it or live beneath it, but that she heard it, that it gave her messages. Warnings sometimes, gentle nudges at others, not in words, not in anything you could repeat, but in shapes, in dreams. In the warmth on her right shoulder when she stood at the edge of the wood. At first no one paid it much mind. The clan had always had people who saw things, who claimed to dream in colors or follow the flight of birds a little too closely, but she was different. Quiet, mostly, soft-spoken. She never demanded anything, never raised her voice, and that's partly why they started listening. She never said what the sun wanted. She said what it noticed, that a mother had wept alone too many nights in a row, that the meat was being cooked too quickly, and the flame was angry, that the children had stopped making up songs in the river bend. She said these things gently, almost shyly, while sitting cross-legged on the edge of the firelight, not looking at anyone in particular, but the words landed, and people changed things. Because after she spoke, the mornings always seemed warmer. People began to visit her when the sun was highest. Not for healing, not for prophecy, just to sit in the light near her. They didn't talk much. Sometimes they shared fruit, or a drink of water. Sometimes they simply sat in silence, eyes closed, letting the light touch their faces, and she'd nod, faintly, as if agreeing with something that couldn't be heard. The elders didn't try to stop it. They were cautious, yes, stories of those who claimed too much were always whispered at night. But she never claimed to be anything, only to hear, and that made it harder to dismiss. They say she once walked for 3 days, barefoot, following a patch of light that wouldn't stay still. She came back quiet, exhausted, skin burned on one side. When asked what she'd seen, she only said, "The sun remembers us when we remember each other." Some thought it meant nothing. Others still repeat the line, even now. There was a time, later, when a sickness spread, the kind that made the young cough and the old too tired to wake. It came fast, and no one could stop it. People stopped gathering. Fires were lit further apart. Voices fell silent. And one morning, just before the sun rose, she stood in the center of the camp and raised her hand. She didn't speak. She just stood there, tall and still, as the light came. And when it touched her face, people said it was different. Not brighter, not whiter, but fuller, as if the sun had leaned down just a little more than usual, as if it had seen her. The sickness passed, eventually, as such things did, but from that moment on, no one questioned her again. When she died, they buried her facing east. They placed stones in a circle around her, open at the side where the light would first arrive. They didn't sing, they didn't speak, they just waited in silence for the sun to rise. And when it did, and the warmth fell across the stones, someone whispered, almost too softly to hear, "She's listening from the other side now," and no one doubted it. The light that fell on the wrong face. There was a rule, though no one remembered when it started. The first light belonged to the chosen. Each morning the clan would rise slowly, stretching limbs beneath thick hides, the cold still clinging to their fingertips. But long before breakfast, before the fire was stirred fully back to life, someone would sit alone at the edge of camp, facing east. Always the same spot, always the same person. It wasn't a position of power, not in the way we think of it now. It wasn't earned or fought for. It was trusted, passed quietly from one to the next, chosen by the elders, often without explanation. The person who bore the morning light was expected to say nothing, just sit, open-palmed, and let it happen. Let the sun arrive. Let the warmth find their face first. They called it bearing the dawn. A quiet burden, a gentle roll. It was believed that the first rays carried memory of all the people who'd seen that same sun in the generations before. The one who received it, even for a few seconds, helped carry that memory forward, helped link the past to the present. And then, one morning, it went wrong. No one knows why. Maybe the clouds had moved oddly the night before. Maybe the smoke from the cook fire drifted strangely in the breeze. Maybe someone had shifted a stone without realizing. Or maybe, and this is what people whispered later, maybe the sun had simply decided differently. Because when the light came, soft, warm and golden, it didn't fall on the chosen one. It landed on someone else. A boy, young, barely past his first winter with the hunting party. He wasn't sitting forward. He wasn't even facing east. He'd woken late, wandered to the edge of camp with sleep still in his eyes, chewing on a strip of root, and the sun found him. It lit his shoulders first, then the crown of his hair, then his entire face. And for a long moment, the rest of the camp froze. Even the fire stopped crackling. All eyes turned to the boy, and to the one who was supposed to receive the dawn. She didn't speak. The old woman who had sat in that spot for 13 winters straight. She only bowed her head, slowly, as if the sun had whispered something only she could hear. No one knew what to do. The boy looked confused, then scared. He stepped backward, out of the light, as if he'd stepped into someone else's story by accident. But the sun had already touched him. That couldn't be undone. That day, nothing quite felt right. People moved slower. The hunt was clumsy. Someone tripped carrying water. The coals didn't catch the way they should have. And though no one said it out loud, everyone kept glancing at the sky, wondering if something had shifted permanently. That night, the elders gathered. No shouting, no accusations, just silence and long looks. Then the old woman, the one who'd bowed her head, stood and said, "It wasn't a mistake, it was a reminder. The light does not belong to us, we are only its guests." The next morning, she didn't take her usual place. She stood behind the boy instead. And when the first light came again, it touched his face a second time. He didn't flinch this time. He just stood very still. And from then on, he was the one who bore the dawn. But they never called him chosen. They stopped using that word altogether. They began calling the morning roll the watched one. Because after that day, they no longer believed they were choosing who received the light. They believed the light was choosing them. Why shadows were counted like days? They didn't have calendars. Not like we do now. No numbered squares, no pages to tear away, no names for months or days of the week. But they knew time. And more than that, they felt it, in the shift of a breeze, in the smell of damp leaves, in the way the sky changed tone after the rain. But the most certain way they kept time was by watching shadows, because the shadows never lied. Every morning they stretched long and thin, like limbs waking from sleep. They touched the edges of huts, reached across stone paths, slithered over tree roots and into cracks in the earth, and as the sun rose higher, the shadows pulled back, shorter, tighter, hiding under feet and under tools. Then by afternoon, they stretched again, thick and wide, their angles shifting like breath. Children were taught early to notice them, not just where they pointed, but how they moved. The stories say there was once a boy who didn't know how old he was, because no one had counted winters yet. But he could tell you how many shadows had passed since he'd seen a lion, how many since his sister learned to speak, how many since the sky had stayed grey for 2 straight days. That's how they understood time, not in distance, but in presence. A shadow was a marker, not an absence of light, but a reminder that light had once touched there. They would carve lines into stone based on the shape a shadow made at midday. They'd place sticks upright in circles and trace the edge of the shadow over hours, over days. Not as science, as memory, as a way of holding on, as a way of knowing that yesterday had happened, and tomorrow would come again. Some families passed down stones marked not with names, but with shadow lines, small ridges showing where the sun had stood when something was lost, or found, or remembered. One stone had a long deep line, carved during the day the hunter never returned. Another had notches from when a child was born, and the first light hit her closed eyes. You couldn't rush a shadow, it arrived when the light did. It stayed only as long as it was meant to, it stretched and folded according to a rhythm that no one controlled. And yet, that rhythm became the most trusted thing they had. More reliable than voices, more certain than memory. In the cold months, the shadows were different, slower, lower, sometimes barely there beneath a grey sky. But when they came, they felt heavier. As if the light had to try harder, and the shadow it made was more real. People said those were the days when time itself slowed, waiting, listening. One woman, a quiet one, who carved birds into driftwood and rarely spoke unless she was laughing, began to count the length of her own shadow every evening. Not for superstition, not for study, just to know, to feel how her life was stretching alongside the light. And when she grew old, and her steps slowed, she said, "I've walked through more shadows than footsteps now. That must mean I've lasted longer than I ever meant to." They smiled when she said it, and they nodded. Because everyone understood. They believed that when the body was gone, the shadow stayed, not on the ground, not in light, but in memory. In the long stretch of what someone had once stood for, the shape they left behind. So they counted shadows, not just for the passing of time, but because it gave shape to what was otherwise invisible, the soft unfolding of a life, one line at a time. The first time a cloud was taken as a sign, it was only one cloud, nothing dramatic, not dark or heavy, not a thunderhead or a strange omen rising from the horizon, just a pale smear across the morning sky, drifting slow and alone, like something forgotten by the wind. But that was exactly why they noticed it, because the sky that season had been too perfect, clear for weeks, unbroken, the kind of blue that felt endless, like a bowl turned over the world. Every day the sun climbed the same path. Every night it sank without protest, and in between heat, long, steady heat, enough to crack the bark on certain trees, enough to make rivers hesitate, enough to make people begin looking at one another with quiet worry. So when the cloud came, it stopped conversations mid-sentence. Someone pointed. Someone else stood. A child blinked up and asked if it was smoke. But the elders didn't move right away. They just stared. And then slowly, as if following a script written long before language, they gathered their things and walked to the hill above camp. No one asked why. They followed. At the top, they formed a loose circle, facing west, where the cloud drifted. It had grown slightly, not larger, but taller. The edges curled in a way that made some people tilt their heads. It didn't look like any animal. It didn't resemble a face. But still, something about it felt personal. One elder stepped forward and raised her hand toward it. Not in fear, not in command, just acknowledgement. And then she said, "It's time." No one asked what for. They simply began preparations. Not hurried, not panicked, but deliberate. The kind of movements you only make when you feel something bigger than yourself brush the edge of your life. Later by the fire, someone finally asked what she'd meant. She smiled and said, "You don't always wait for the storm to speak clearly. Sometimes, it only gets one word. And sometimes, that word is a cloud." It was the first time anyone in the camp had treated something in the sky, other than the sun, as a message. And from that point on, clouds weren't just weather, they were signals. They meant change. They meant mood. They meant the sky wasn't just watching, it was speaking, softly, carefully, sometimes in riddles, sometimes in silence, but always with purpose. The next time a thin veil of cloud passed, they didn't wait to see what it did. They gathered water early. They brought in drying hides. They told stories around the fire about the last time the sky had whispered, just to keep their minds ready. They began to read the sky, like you'd read an old friend's face. A furrow in its brow meant tension. A pale haze meant caution. A break in the pattern, even a lovely one, meant something was being asked. They no longer assumed they had all the answers, because if the sun could speak with light, then surely the sky could speak with shadow. And if a single cloud could make people pause in the middle of a clear day, really pause, then maybe that was the point. Maybe it had been trying to remind them of something they'd nearly forgotten, that stillness matters. that nothing lasts forever, and that sometimes the sky changes just enough to wake you. Why they sang louder when the light faded? It wasn't fear, not exactly, not the kind that made your breath quicken or your hands tremble. It was something quieter, older, a kind of remembering that lived deeper than language. That's what people felt when the light began to fade. Evening always arrived the same way. First, the color drained from the sky, leaving everything washed in a pale softness. Then the shadows stretched, touching things they hadn't touched all day. And finally, the wind changed direction, just slightly, like it had somewhere else to be. And when that happened, they began to sing. Not because they were happy, not because they needed cheering, but because that was the moment the sun left, and no one wanted it to leave in silence. The songs were not rehearsed, no one led, they simply began, first one voice, then another, and then a wave of soft sound moving through the camp like a warm tide. Some songs had words, old and half forgotten, others were just sounds, hums and tones that rose and dipped like the hills beyond the trees. They weren't meant for performance, they weren't meant to be remembered, they were meant to fill the space the light had just left behind. Children would stop what they were doing, drawn by the sound, sitting near the fire without asking questions. Even the dogs would go quiet, tails thumping softly against the ground, listening as though the voices carried meaning they too understood. Sometimes, if the day had been long or strange, if someone had been lost or a hunt had failed, the songs grew louder, not wild, but full, a way of holding the sun's last warmth in their throats a little longer, a way of refusing to let the light slip away unnoticed. Elders said the sky heard them, that the songs gave the sun something to carry through the night, that without the songs, the light would return weaker, thinner, unsure it was wanted. And so they sang, even when they were tired, even when the cold crept close, even when the firewood was low and the embers needed tending. They sang because the voice was a kind of flame too, because when enough people joined in, the dark didn't feel like emptiness, it felt like a pause, like a breath, like something waiting to begin again. Some believed that the louder the song, the better the dreams, that the sound lingered, curling into the shelters, soaking into the skin, keeping the cold just a step further back. And in the deepest part of the night, if someone woke and felt afraid, they might remember the songs, not the notes, not the melody, but the feeling that they hadn't gone into the dark alone, that the last thing they'd given to the sky had been full of life. By morning the songs were forgotten, but not really, because the sun always came back, and they always had more to sing. The line of stones that faced the equinox. No one called it an equinox. Not then. They didn't have the word. They didn't need it. But they felt it. Twice each year, the light balanced itself. Not too long, not too short, day and night standing on even ground, and the people noticed, not with clocks, but with shadows, with breath, with the strange stillness that came over the land in those days, the quiet that wasn't absence, but attention, the world listening to itself. They began to mark it, first by memory, then by habit, and finally in stone. It started with a single rock, upright, planted in earth, where the morning sun hit just so. Then another was added beside it, spaced carefully, so that when the sun rose at its perfect center, not north, not south, not leaning to either side, its light would pass cleanly between them, like a thread through the eye of a needle. Over time the line grew, not in a rush, not with ceremony, just slowly. One stone, then two, each one added when the timing was right, when the light was perfect, when someone noticed and said, "Here, this is where it stood." It wasn't a temple, it wasn't a grave, it was a memory made visible, a calendar not of days, but of light. People walked the line when they were uncertain, they traced it with their fingers when the weather changed, or when someone was born, or when silence hung too heavy in the air. The stones didn't speak, but they reflected, they held the sun when it returned. They reminded the people that balance was not just possible, it happened, every year, right in front of them. One elder said that the stones remembered the shape of fairness, that they marked the only 2 days when no one had more light than another, when the sun gave equally, without preference. That's why the children were brought there, not just to see, but to feel the balance, to stand in its center and stretch out their arms and know, even if just for a moment, that they were part of something exact. On those days, meals were shared without asking, no one kept more than they needed. Fires were lit in the open, and stories were told with laughter, not just for warmth. It wasn't a holiday. There were no feasts or dances, just presence, a kind of sacred noticing. And always, someone watched the line, waiting for the moment when the light passed straight and clean between the stones, and when it did, even for a second, people didn't cheer, they just nodded, as if the sky had promised something, and kept it. Not everyone believed the stones held power. Some just saw rocks and shadows, but even those who doubted still stepped carefully near them, still lowered their voice, still paused just a little longer when the sun hovered in that perfect place, because deep down they knew the line was more than stone. It was memory that couldn't be forgotten. It was time, set in earth. It was a way of saying, we were here when the light stood still, and we will be here when it stands still again. When they waited all night just to see it rise, they knew it would come. They always knew. But sometimes, knowing wasn't enough. There were nights when it mattered more, when the sun's return wasn't just expected, it was needed. Nights that stretched too long, winds that howled too strangely, fires that wouldn't catch, dreams that came too sharp and fast, like memories that didn't belong to anyone still breathing. And on those nights, they waited, not indoors, not wrapped in warmth, but outside, on the cold stone ridges, or the open grass cleared the day before, eyes toward the eastern hills, lips closed tight against the wind, every heartbeat counting the seconds between darkness and something like hope, waiting for the sun. Not for light to read by, not for warmth, not for certainty, just to see it. Because seeing it made the world make sense again. There was no ritual for it, no chants, no drums, just presence. Stillness, the kind of silence that only happens when every single person is hoping for the same thing at the same time. Even the children sat quietly. Even the animals seemed to know. They waited for hours. Sometimes it rained. Sometimes the clouds swallowed the stars. Sometimes the wind pressed so cold against their faces that tears formed without emotion. Still, they stayed, huddled close, some with arms around knees, others with hands dug deep into the dirt, grounding themselves in the only thing that wasn't moving. It wasn't about fear, not really, it was about connection. Because when the sun didn't rise on time, when it lingered below the line of trees longer than it should, doubt crept in. Was it angry? Had they failed? Was there something forgotten? Some offering not given, some fire not tended, some song not sung. And yet, when it finally came, when the faintest ribbon of gold edged the rim of the world, no one spoke, no one clapped, no one rose, they just breathed, some with tears, some with laughter caught in their throats, some too tired to feel much of anything but the warmth pressing softly against their cheeks. One woman whispered, "There you are," not to the sky, not to the sun, but to herself, because seeing the sun again, after a night like that, was like remembering who you were. The elders said it had always been this way, since before the stones, since before the shelters, since before fire, even, that something deep inside them, something old and buried, still feared the dark could win, and so they waited, even when they knew it would return, even when they had counted the cycles and watched the stars and marked the days, because seeing it rise was different than believing it would. There was a kind of healing in it, a kind of confirmation, a soft reminder that some things still moved the way they should, and that even the longest, most uncertain night ends eventually, with light. The day the sun didn't warm the ground. It rose like always. The shape of it was the same. Round, bright, silent, it climbed above the hills the way it had every morning before, pushing soft orange light through the branches, brushing across the roofs of the shelters, sliding gently down the backs of sleeping animals. But the ground stayed cold. Someone noticed it first with bare feet. A hunter, rising early to check the meat racks, stepped outside and paused. The light touched his skin. Yes, but it didn't sink in. It was like warmth had forgotten to arrive with it, like the sun had shown up in body, but not in spirit. He said nothing, not right away, but others felt it too. A child curled near the fire, opened her eyes and didn't squint against the light, because there was no heat in it. A woman brushing ash off a stone looked up at the sky and frowned, then laid her palm flat against the earth. It stayed cold, unchanged. The fire burned, but the air stayed sharp. The light came, but the frost clung stubbornly to the grass. Even the birds were quiet, and that's when they started whispering. Something was wrong, not broken, exactly, just off, like a drum beat, one breath, too slow, like a name said with the wrong weight. No one wanted to say it aloud, that maybe the sun was fading, that maybe it had grown tired of this world, that maybe they'd asked too much of it, and now it was retreating, giving only light but no life. An elder touched the stone where they'd marked the last solstice. She said, "It's not the day. The sun is where it should be," but still her hands trembled. They tried to warm the ground with more fire. They stoked the flames higher. They burned extra wood, even though they knew they'd miss it later. They huddled close, but the warmth didn't spread. It just stayed in small circles, as if afraid to move too far. By midday, they gathered near the edge of the clearing and watched the light. It was bright, blinding, even, but something inside it felt distant, like it wasn't really meant for them. The shadows were sharp, but the soil beneath their feet stayed hard, dry, and chilled. That was when someone asked, quietly, "Did we do something wrong?" It wasn't a question of science. It was a question of relationship, because for them, the sun wasn't a ball of gas in space. It was presence, a giver, a listener, a god, maybe, but a familiar one, a daily companion. And this silence in the warmth, it felt personal. The stories told of times like this, old times when the sky turned away from the people for reasons no one remembered, days when the sun shone but didn't stay, when the world looked alive but felt like stone, days when seeds refused to rise from the soil, when rivers sparkled but didn't steam, when skin cracked beneath clothing and mouths stayed closed through the morning meal. So they sang, not loudly, not joyfully, but with purpose. A quiet offering, a reminder that they remembered, that they noticed, that the sun's absence of warmth still meant something, that even a cold light was worthy of attention. One of the elders burned dried herbs, not for magic, but for memory. The smoke curled up lazily, catching gold in the sunlight, refusing to rise quickly. She said the sun would come back fully, that it always did, but her voice had that tone, the one people used when they weren't entirely certain. By evening the light bent the way it always had. It fell across their stones, it kissed the edges of the forest, but the ground never softened. That night, they didn't sleep in silence. They told the old stories, of winters that stretched too far, of summers that arrived too late, of fire made from desperation, of mornings where you had to fake belief until the warmth returned. And in the middle of the night, someone whispered a prayer, not to the sky, not to the flame, but to the ground itself, asking it to hold on, just a little longer, until the warmth remembered how to return. Why they believed the sun could judge, it was never written down, but everyone knew it. The sun saw everything, not just what was done in its light, but what was carried into that light, the thoughts, the intentions, the small cracks in a person's spirit they thought were hidden. The sun didn't need language, it didn't need proof. It simply looked, and in its gaze, truth rose up like mist from the morning grass. They believed the sun could judge, not with punishment, not with wrath, but with exposure, because nothing could lie in full light. It was the way children paused when they stepped into it, after telling a half-truth, the way adults hesitated before speaking certain words outdoors, their voices softening, their posture shifting just slightly, as if someone was listening. It was in the way decisions were made at noon, when the sun stood highest, because then there were no shadows to hide in. Disagreements were settled, not in corners or shelters, but in the open, with bare feet in warm soil, and the light above, to witness. No one interrupted. No one lied easily. The sun had a way of burning dishonesty into the skin, even if no one else spoke up. And when someone did wrong, not just a mistake, but something cruel, selfish, hidden, the community didn't always need to call it out. They waited to see how that person stood in the light, because you could tell, you could see it in their walk, in how long they took to emerge in the morning, in how their eyes shifted beneath the brightness, blinking more than they needed to, as if the sun itself was pressing too hard on the truth. Some believed the sun warmed the good, and ignored the rest. Others believed it warmed everyone, but only so that no one could pretend the cold was someone else's fault. Children were taught to raise their palms to the light, and feel its weight, not just heat, weight, a reminder that the sun didn't just grow things, it knew things, that fairness wasn't something people created, it was something the sky expected. When a hunt went wrong, and fingers pointed in blame, they waited until morning. They stood together in the dawn, eyes forward, and spoke one by one. The light would find the truth, they believed. It always did. Not with thunder, not with curses, but with silence so exact it pressed guilt from the body, like breath from a sleeping mouth. Sometimes when someone had done something truly harmful, something they couldn't explain or undo, they would walk alone at sunrise, shirtless, barefoot, open, not as punishment, as confession, not to the people, to the sun, to the only thing that could see straight through them, and offer no mercy, no comfort, only clarity. Some elders claimed that on certain days the sun grew hotter when truth was near, that it pulsed differently, that it focused, that you could feel your own honesty, or your guilt, reflected back into your bones, and yet, it wasn't feared. The sun didn't strike, it revealed, and revelation to them was sacred, because to be seen completely, even for your worst, was to be known, and in being known, you could begin again. That's why when people wept, they did it outside. Why forgiveness, when granted, was done with both parties standing in sunlight. Why the first steps after grief, after betrayal, after terrible mistakes, always led toward the east. Because the sun didn't judge the way people did. It didn't remember your crimes. It simply reminded you that you did, and in that remembering, came the question, would you walk forward again, or remain in the shadow of yourself? That was the sun's judgment, not condemnation, but choice, and every day it rose it offered it again. The marks left on skin after the offering, they didn't talk about it much, not because it was shameful, but because it was sacred. Offerings to the sun weren't asked for. They were given, and when they were true, when they came from a place deeper than fear, deeper than obligation, the sun responded. Not with words, not with warmth, but with something stranger, something lasting. It left marks, not always visible, not always the same, but always there. They could be burns, small ones, no larger than a thumbprint, formed after a palm was held too long toward the sky at midday, or patterns in the skin where dust or ash settled, warmed by the heat and pressed into the body like a quiet brand. Some said they appeared overnight, that a person could sleep after the rite and wake with lines down their back, like branches or rays or cracks in old stone. No one knew if the sun made them, or if something in the body remembered too hard. The marks weren't sought. They weren't signs of favor. They weren't worn with pride or used for status. They were personal, intimate, proof of an exchange. Because the offerings weren't simple. Some brought dried fruit, or bone, or shaped stone. Things made by hand, wrapped in cloth and laid at dawn where the light first touched the earth, but others gave more. Pieces of themselves, a strand of hair, a drop of blood, the tip of a finger in older, darker stories. Things given not for reward, but in desperation, in thanks, in grief. And the sun, it seemed, remembered. Those who gave deeply changed, their bodies bore it. A strange warmth in the joints, a sensitivity to cold, eyes that didn't flinch when the sky blazed overhead. One man had a mark that never faded, a perfect ring on his chest where he'd pressed a heated stone during a death rite for his child. The others said they could feel it hum when he stood near firelight. The marks weren't punishment, they weren't warnings, they were echoes. Some said the sun didn't ask for anything, but it noticed what was given, that it kept a kind of memory in its heat, that its light moved differently through those who had offered more. You could see it in how they sat at the edge of sunrise, not close but not afraid. You could hear it in how they spoke, slowly, evenly, as if timing their breath to the sky's rhythm. You could feel it in their silence, never empty, always full of something unspoken. When someone came back from an offering changed, no one questioned them. They were given space. Food was brought to them without asking. Children didn't stare, elders didn't touch, because what the sun gave back after taking something was never fully understood. The marks weren't always physical. Some began to dream differently, to hum at certain times of day, to smell rain before it fell, to sense when fire was dying, even from across the camp. One woman began tracing circles in the dirt every time the light shifted. She didn't know why, but she did it every day. For years, the sun, they believed, didn't need gifts. But it listened when they were given freely, and when it answered, it left proof, not for the world, for the one who gave, a reminder etched in skin, in movement, in dream and breath, that once for a moment, they had been seen, completely, and touched. Why they couldn't sleep until the fire matched the sky. It wasn't about fear, not entirely. They didn't wait beside the fire just because of wolves, or the cold, or the things that moved without name in the dark. Those were reasons, yes, good ones. But the truth ran deeper. Older, they stayed awake because the fire hadn't yet matched the sky. It was something taught in quiet gestures. No one said it aloud. But children learned, watching their elders, that rest didn't come the moment the sun set. It came only after the flames on the ground reached a certain rhythm, a shape, a glow that echoed what the sun had done hours earlier, not in brightness, not in size, in feeling. When the sun dipped below the hills, it left behind a trail, warm, not hot, gentle, not gone. A color that sat somewhere between memory and presence, and the fire was meant to hold that echo, to stretch the sun's hand into the night, to remind the people that they weren't truly alone, but a fire lit too quickly, or too bright, or too careless, didn't carry that feeling. It was impatient, unsettled. It flickered like a lie, and so they waited. They fed it slowly, bark first, then the thinner twigs, then the coals. They'd sit and listen to it settle, not just burn but become still. The moment came when the fire didn't just give heat, it gave weight. It felt grounded, present, as if the sun, instead of leaving, had stepped quietly into the stones at their feet. That's when they knew it was time to sleep. Before that, something in them stayed awake, not from habit, but from knowing that sleep, without the right fire, was thinner, shallower. Dreams came too fast, or not at all. People woke colder, lonelier. There were more silences in the morning, more glances that didn't quite meet. The elders said it wasn't the flame that mattered, it was the way it held the day, and it wasn't just about light, it was about continuity, a thread from one sky to the next, from the warmth that left to the warmth they had to make. If the thread broke, if the fire was wrong, something in the heart faltered. They used certain wood for it, never green, never wet. Some pieces had been set aside for days, waiting just for this. There were stories carved into them, marks from previous winters, finger-length cuts from teeth and tools. When those burned, the fire carried more than heat. It carried memory, and that was what sleep needed. A memory of safety, not the illusion of it, the inheritance of it. Even the youngest children, barely able to speak, would sometimes crawl closer to the fire, eyes half shut, fingers outstretched, as if to test whether it felt like the sky they remembered. And if it didn't, they didn't rest. Some nights the fire never quite got there. Something was off, a wrong wind, wet wood, too much silence or too much talking. And on those nights, people stayed up longer, tending, listening, waiting for the moment when the spark stopped fighting and simply glowed. When they did, bodies relaxed, shoulders softened, the need to watch, to guard, to measure every sound, eased. People leaned into each other, blankets fell easier over the legs, breath grew deeper, and sleep came, because now, finally, the fire matched the sky, and so they could let go. The night they thought the sun was gone for good, it began like any other night. The fire had been built slow, the kindling laid with care, the coals from the previous day still warm beneath the ash. The sky had changed color in the usual way, from blue to orange, to a kind of deep indigo that signaled it was time to sit down, eat quietly, and listen for the first signs of cold. But something was different. Not loud, not sharp, just off. The stars came late, the wind didn't move, and the last light the sun left behind felt thinner than it should have, like a thread stretched too far, like a goodbye not meant to return. No one said it out loud at first. That would have made it real. But the silence said plenty. People sat closer to the flames that night, not for warmth, for presence. Their bodies pressed together in quiet clusters. Eyes drifted upward now and then, toward the dark curve of the sky, searching for something they couldn't name. The elders stared longest, not blinking, and that's when the fear settled in, the kind that came not from danger, but from absence, from the realization that the most dependable thing in their world, the sun, might not be coming back. There were stories, of course, old ones, the kind told only once or twice a year, around fires too small for comfort, about the time the sun disappeared, about entire seasons that came and went in shadow, about fields that froze solid and rivers that stopped singing, about birds that forgot to fly, about people who forgot how to wait. One elder, the oldest, finally spoke. His voice was rough, barely a whisper, like bark being peeled from wet wood. If the sun has left us, he said, it is because we failed to carry it. No one knew what that meant, but no one argued. They stared into the fire, trying to read something in the flames, trying to remember what it felt like when light meant something, when morning was a promise instead of a question. The children cried softly that night, not out of pain, but confusion, the kind of sadness that didn't have a shape yet, the kind that reached inward, deep, and simply said something is missing. They burned more wood than they should have. Wood meant for the next 3 days, it didn't matter. They fed the flames as if trying to bribe the sky, to remind it how brightness worked, to hold on to something, anything, that still gave off warmth. Some whispered to the fire, as if it could speak back. Others sang, not chants, but half melodies remembered from childhood, quiet, trembling sounds that weren't meant to fix anything, just to fill the space. The air didn't move, the stars didn't shift, the night held, and still the sun did not come. The sky remained dark longer than anyone had known it to. The horizon offered nothing, no glow, no blush of gold, just black, endless and heavy. And that's when someone asked the question, not out loud, just in thought. What if this is forever? What if light doesn't return? The fire began to shrink. Even with the extra fuel, it couldn't pretend forever. The flames pulled tight into themselves, the red glow softening to a memory, faces dimmed, eyes lowered, words stopped, and then, just as the last ember dimmed, the smallest shape of light touched the rim of the distant trees. No one saw it at first, but the birds did. One chirped, then another, then the mist shifted, then someone's breath caught in their throat, and there it was. Not bright, not brave, just there. A sliver of sun, hesitant, like it had been deciding whether to return at all. But it did. And the moment it did, every person there, every tired, quiet soul, exhaled, a breath they didn't know they'd been holding, a relief they didn't dare name. The sun had not left for good. It had only reminded them how easily it could. And from that night on, they never took it for granted again. The fire was no longer just a comfort. It was a promise, one they kept alive, night after night, just in case the sun ever needed help finding its way back. Why only the old knew when to look away. They said it without words, with the tilt of a head, with the soft turn of the neck just before the sky reached its brightest. The old ones knew when to look away, not out of weakness, not because the sun hurt them more than it did others, but because they'd learned, slowly across the long curve of years, that there were moments when the sun did not want to be seen. Moments when staring back at it too long wasn't strength, it was arrogance. Children stared openly, eyes wide, blinking, curious. Young adults looked boldly, daring to meet the light head-on, believing that endurance meant reverence. But the elders, they lowered their gaze, not in fear, in respect, in understanding. They remembered, not just stories told at night, but the feeling of mornings when the sun came in too hard, when crops failed from too much heat, when rivers dried to silence, when bodies grew dizzy and eyes burned from more light than the earth had asked for. They remembered the year the sun turned pale, then red, then disappeared behind a veil of dust and smoke. When they thought it might not return again, they remembered the silence that followed, days of greyness and confusion, when even the birds forgot to sing, and when it came back, they didn't celebrate. They only watched it quietly, and then looked away, because they knew the sun was not just a warmth, it was a watcher, it held memory, and there were things, even light shouldn't always reveal. The oldest ones were the first to turn their backs when offerings were made. When fires were lit to mimic the rising dawn, they faced the other way, not to reject it, but to balance it, to remind the people that not all power wanted witnesses. Some said the old could sense when the sun was too close, that on certain days, solstice mornings, eclipsed afternoons, they'd move slower, speak softer, cast fewer shadows, not because they were tired, but because they could feel the weight of something pressing just beyond the sky. They never warned the young. They let them look, let them learn. Because to earn the instinct to look away, one had to first be burned by too much knowing. And so they sat at the edge of the gathering, faces angled toward shade, eyes focused on hands, or flames, or nothing at all. They smiled when others stared upward, but it was a sad kind of smile, the kind that knew what came next. That brightness wasn't always a blessing, that some truths once seen couldn't be forgotten. One elder once whispered that the sun tested people, that it watched for those who refused to blink, and when it found them, it gave them visions, but not the kind they wanted. He said light can reveal too much, that some faces, some thoughts, some regrets were better seen in the flicker of firelight than under the full weight of the sun. So they looked away, not because they couldn't bear it, because they chose not to. And in that choice, they taught the rest something the young couldn't understand yet. That wisdom wasn't in knowing everything, it was in knowing when to stop looking. The fire they built to call it back. They didn't always trust that it would return. Most mornings, the sun came like breath, expected, unnoticed. But there were nights when the sky felt too wide, too silent. Nights when even the stars flickered, like they were considering staying dark. And on those nights, something in the people shifted. A memory stirred, an unease passed between them, like cold wind through bone. So they built the fire, not for heat, not for cooking. They built it to call the sun back. It started with a circle, always a circle. Stones chosen not just for shape, but for history. Ones that had seen many winters, that had held warmth before. They were laid down with care, not spoken over, as if even words might disturb whatever silent rite was unfolding. Then came the wood, not just dry, clean, pieces kept hidden for weeks, rubbed with sage or pine, sometimes painted with a red handmark or wrapped in thin string made from animal sinew. These weren't scraps, these were chosen, offered. The flame was never sparked quickly. The first glow was meant to wake, not burn. Moss, then bark, then thin twigs. A breath, not a gust. A hand, not a strike. The goal wasn't fire. The goal was memory. The recreation of something sacred, something the sun might recognize. As the fire took shape, they didn't watch it. They listened. Listened for the moment. It stopped crackling like hunger and began to hum like heartbeat. The moment it stopped asking for fuel and began giving something back. It was a shift you couldn't see, only feel. The warmth changed. The smoke rose differently. The air bent around it in a way that made the shadows lean closer, like they too were waiting for something. That's when they sang, not loudly, not together. Each voice was its own thread, loose and private. Some didn't sing at all, just mouthed the shapes, as if the sound might distract the sun or call the wrong kind of attention. It wasn't worship, it was memory. A reminder to the sky that they still waited, that they still believed. No one knew if it worked. But it always helped, because when morning came, and it always did, eventually, they weren't surprised. They were relieved, and grateful, not for light, but for return. They said the sun could feel when it was wanted, that it stayed longer when called gently, when invited, that if it ever left for good, it wouldn't be because it grew tired, but because no one remembered how to ask. So they built the fire, every year, every season, not because they feared the dark, but because they honored the light, because in that fire was more than flame, it was invitation, and if the sun ever hovered at the edge of forgetting, one last ember glowing in the center of the world might be enough to remind it where it was needed. What they believed the sun saw in them. They never truly looked at the sun, not directly. They watched the way it touched the trees, how it moved across the skins of animals and the backs of their own hands. They saw it reflected in water, in the sheen of stone, in the shimmering edge of a blade pulled fresh from the fire. But the sun itself, that they only glimpsed, and yet they believed it saw them, not just as shapes, not as shadows that passed briefly over the ground, but as something deeper, as patterns, as stories, as a people made of decisions and doubts and small unspoken rituals that meant more than words. They believed the sun saw everything they tried to hide. It saw who rose early, and who waited for others to stoke the coals. It saw who took the last piece of meat without asking. It saw who knelt before the fire, and who walked past it without bowing their head. And more than anything, they believed it remembered. Not like a god counting sins, not like a punishment waiting to happen, but like a witness, a watcher, a constant presence that quietly, endlessly, knew. Some said the sun could see the hunger in a man before he felt it in his belly, that it knew which woman would carry life long before her body changed, that it could feel the loneliness in a child sitting too far from the others, that it warmed people not based on distance or season, but need. There were stories of people who were lost for days in the hills. Snow had fallen too soon. Tracks vanished. Hope thinned like breath in cold air. But they followed the light, not its path across the sky, but how it struck certain stones, how it paused on certain ridges, and they found their way back, as if the sun had been guiding them not to safety, but to understanding. They believed the sun saw intention, that even if someone failed, the light would favor those who had meant to do right. It would linger a second longer on someone who offered their food before their words, who stayed behind to mend what others had ignored, who looked upward not to ask, but to listen, and they believed the sun could be disappointed, not in mistakes, but in cruelty, in pride, in forgetfulness. If the sun burned too hot one day, cracked the soil, turned the river sluggish, they didn't curse it. They asked what they'd forgotten, what debt had gone unpaid, what story hadn't been told, what kindness had been withheld, because the sun in their hearts was not only a giver, it was a mirror. And so they lived with that in mind. They stepped carefully in the light. They spoke softer in its full glow. They passed knowledge from elder to child with a hand on the shoulder, and their faces turned toward the dawn. Because in every moment, they believed the sun was watching, not to judge, but to understand, to see who they were when they thought no one was looking. And in that quiet certainty, they carried themselves a little differently, not in fear, but in hope. Hope that something larger saw their effort, that the warmth they felt was not just fire in the sky, but recognition. The name they gave the sun, but never spoke. There was a name, given, not found, held quietly between generations, but never spoken aloud, not even once. It was not the first name they gave the sun. That one was used freely. It was called the Eye, when they needed it to see, the fire above, when they needed warmth, the giant's heart, when crops grew well. The children learned those names. They shouted them in play. They carved them into bone and stone. But the true name, the one kept only in breath and never in voice, was something different. It was whispered, only in the mind. It didn't sound like anything. It felt like something, like the feeling of waking before the light reached the floor of the shelter, like the hush just before a sunrise broke over the edge of the world, like warmth on skin after hours of cold that had settled in the bones, like being watched, not as a threat, but as a child, beneath the gaze of something old enough to remember before time began. They said the name was given long before they lived in circles, before they cooked, or counted, or carved, when they only knew the sun as a presence that appeared, disappeared, and returned, no matter what happened on the ground. It was during those early winters, when the sky sometimes held back its light too long, that someone, somewhere, shaped the name in thought, a name so heavy with meaning that to speak it aloud would be to draw attention, and attention from the sun wasn't always safe. Because the sun was not just life, it was truth. It saw things as they were. It burned away lies. It showed the dirt beneath the leaves, the crack beneath the stone, the tears that had not yet fallen, and so they did not dare summon it with its truest name. They believed that if you spoke it aloud, the sun might pause, might listen too closely, might see something it wasn't meant to, might not come back. So the name was passed in different ways, a look between two people at dawn, a gesture toward the east with an open palm, the careful way they fed the fire at dusk, not too fast, not too slow, the way they drew circles into the dirt and then brushed them away, the way they pressed their hands into sun-warmed rock and felt for something older than skin. Some said the name was not a word at all, but a silence, a pause between thoughts, the breath held when you first saw the light hit the hills in a way it never had before. The heartbeat skipped when warmth found you after too long without it, and every family had a way of honoring that name. Some wore a mark on the inside of the wrist, others kept a stone, polished only with sunlight. A few kept no sign at all, just memory. It was never written, never sung, never traced in the air, and yet everyone knew it. Even those too young to speak would fall quiet at dawn, as if something deep in the body remembered the weight of that unspoken name, as if the sun itself had placed it there, long before language was needed, because there was power in restraint. There was strength in reverence, and so they held the name, always, not in mouths, in meaning. Because the sun had many faces, but only one name worth fearing, one name worth keeping safe, and in all their years, in all their rituals, they never once spoke it aloud, and the sun, for its part, always returned, as if it too remembered. Why the sun was the first god, and might be the last, before the gods had names, before they had faces carved in stone or robes painted in color, before temples or prayers or rituals passed down by firelight. There was only this, the sun. It didn't speak, it didn't demand, it simply was, and that was enough. They woke to it, measured days by it, marked seasons in its tilt. They sang to it before they had language, reached for it before they had fire, trusted it before they knew what trust meant. It fed the plants, stirred the animals, warmed the skin, drew shadows long across the ground, as if writing something the earth had no mouth to say. The first god wasn't chosen, it didn't compete for worship, it didn't appear in dreams or issue commands from the sky, it just rose, every day, without fail. And in doing so, it asked the first question every living thing has ever answered. Will you rise too, even as they built other gods, ones of wind and stone, of river and hunt? None could touch what the sun meant, because it was not just a source, it was the source. It made everything else possible. Without it, stories ended, paths vanished, names were forgotten. When people knelt before the sun, they weren't asking, they were remembering. Remembering what it felt like to be watched by something that didn't need praise, to be seen not as a servant, but simply as alive. They gave it titles, eventually, Lord of Light, Keeper of the Day, Eye of the World, but it never asked for any of them. The old ones said the sun was the only god that didn't need temples, because it already filled the sky, that it didn't need proof, because everything that lived was its offering, that it didn't need prayers, only presence, that standing in its warmth was the only ritual required. And maybe they were right, because long after names are lost, long after every carved stone has eroded, long after every other god has gone quiet, the sun remains, still rising, still watching, still offering one more morning. Even now, as our world spins faster, as glass replaces open sky, as light becomes something artificial and electric, the sun still climbs, still waits beyond the curtain, still touches the floor in that quiet, golden way. Maybe it will outlast everything, not because it wants to, but because it doesn't know how to stop. And maybe when all the books are closed, when all the words are spent, when no one remembers the stories we told ourselves about power and creation and why we exist, there will still be warmth on the skin, still a glow in the east, still one last god that asks nothing and gives everything, the first god and maybe the last. Hey guys, thank you so much for being here. That was Why the Sun Was More Than Light. It was the first god, and you've just reached the final chapter of the journey. If this story brought you some peace or gave you something to think about, feel free to subscribe, leave a like, and if you know someone who might enjoy slow, quiet storytelling like this, maybe share the video with them too. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are right now? Until next time, stay curious and let the light find you gently.